God bless everyone. Today, I want to share a testimony of our brother, John, who had a heart attack that led to a near-death experience, where he encountered BENSON IDAHOSA. My name is John Anderson. I'm 48 years old, and I live in Houston, Texas. But my life didn't always look like this. I grew up in a small town near New Orleans, and life was always a challenge. My parents worked hard, but the bills kept piling up. We didn't have much, but we had faith, and that was enough, or so I thought. Church was at the heart of our family life, and I never questioned it. Every Sunday, we'd walk to our small local church, dressed in our best clothes, hoping that our faith would carry us through the week. But as I got older, life began to wear me down, and that faith started to fade. When I reached my 30s, it felt like everything was going wrong. I was stuck in a dead-end job, just getting by. And I had big dreams of being a better man and a better father. But it felt like I was always falling short. I kept thinking that if I could just find the right thing, if I could just figure out how to improve my life, everything would change. But it never did. I felt lost, uncertain about where to go next. If you believe in God and near-death experiences, subscribe to Life at NDE today. Discover inspiring messages from God through powerful near-death stories that bring hope and understanding. Hit subscribe now and join us in spreading the light of faith. Then one evening, while flipping through TV channels, I stumbled upon a sermon by a man I had never heard of, BENSON IDAHOSA. At first, I wasn't sure what I was watching. He wasn't an American preacher, and his accent was thick. But there was something about him that caught my attention. IDAHOSA was different. His messages weren't about material success or prosperity, they were about genuine faith, the kind of faith that can move mountains. His passion for God's love was unlike anything I had ever heard. It wasn't just about a distant, unreachable power, it was about a force that could heal and restore every area of your life. His energy was contagious. And for the first time in years, I felt hope stirring inside me. I started following him, watching every sermon I could find, reading his books, and learning about his ministry. I discovered that IDAHOSA had risen from humble beginnings in Nigeria to become a global voice for faith and healing. He spoke of miracles, overcoming impossible challenges, and living a life of purpose. For the first time, I believed that my life wasn't over, that maybe I could still turn things around. What stood out most was how he spoke about the power of God's Word. He didn't preach about perfection or doing everything right. Instead, he taught about trusting God and stepping out in faith. I admit, some of his teachings seemed too good to be true. He spoke of prosperity and healing as guaranteed blessings for those who trusted God fully. But in my desperation for change, I clung to every word. My faith in God had always been something I inherited as a child. But IDAHOSA helped me rediscover it. I wasn't just attending church out of habit anymore, I was seeking a deeper connection. His message helped me realize that my circumstances didn't define me, that God had more for me than I could see with my own eyes. I began to believe that with faith, things could change. I believed that God could heal my broken heart, help me overcome debt, and bring peace and prosperity to my family. IDAHOSA's teachings became my foundation. Although I still faced struggles, I started seeing them differently. I was learning to view them through the lens of faith. I found new purpose in my work. I began volunteering more, helping others, and donating what little I could to charity. It wasn't much, But it felt good to contribute to something greater than myself. I believed deeply in the power of faith to transform lives. And I thought I had learned everything there was to know. However, I had no idea how much more I still had to learn. My life and faith were about to be tested in ways I never imagined. Benson Idahosa had become like a spiritual father to me, despite never meeting him in person. His life story, his miracles, and his teachings had been the light that guided me through some of the darkest moments. I was determined to follow his example, trusting that God's power and love would lead me to the breakthrough I desperately needed. But everything changed one night. A night I'll never forget. When I found myself on the edge of life and death, face to face with the man who had taught me so much. What I would experience in the next few hours would change my understanding of God, faith, and life itself forever. It was a Friday night, and I felt utterly exhausted, physically, emotionally, and spiritually. For months, I had been working non-stop, trying to keep up with bills, support my family, and handle the constant pressure life threw at me. The stress had been building. And that evening, it felt like I had reached my breaking point. Sitting in my living room, staring at the unpaid bills scattered across the coffee table, I felt overwhelmed. The weight of the debts seemed insurmountable. I had been trying to stay positive, putting on a brave face for my wife and kids. But inside, I felt like I was drowning. The dreams of prosperity and breakthroughs that Idahosa had preached about seemed far out of reach. I had given so much to the cause, volunteering at church, tithing, helping others, but it didn't feel like enough. Nothing was changing. And I couldn't understand why. That night, after a long day at work, I found myself alone in the living room. The house was quiet. Everyone else had already gone to bed. And it felt like a tomb. I tried to pray, but the words wouldn't come. I couldn't find peace in the silence, only frustration. I closed my eyes, leaned back in my chair, and just breathed deeply, trying to calm the storm inside me. Then, suddenly, I felt a sharp pain in my chest. It was like a vice squeezing my heart. A pain so intense it took my breath away. I gasped for air. But no matter how hard I tried, my lungs seemed to collapse. My vision blurred, and everything around me started to spin. I tried to get up, to move, but my body refused to obey. The pain grew worse. My heart thumped erratically. And I could feel it, something was terribly wrong. I don't know how long I sat there, struggling to breathe. But it felt like an eternity. My mind raced. Was this it? Was I about to die? I had always believed that my faith would carry me through my darkest moments. But now, in this moment, everything felt so uncertain. I could feel nothing but fear and shame. How had I ended up here? Was this the end of my story? I don't remember exactly when it happened. But at some point, I must have lost consciousness. One moment, I was gasping for air. And the next, it felt like my spirit had left my body. It wasn't like anything I'd ever imagined. There was no bright light, no peaceful transition. It felt more like being pulled into a suffocating, dark void. The change was jarring. One moment, I was aware of my living body. And the next, I was drifting away, caught in a vast, cold emptiness. It was unlike anything I had ever experienced before. I couldn't see anything. Yet I could sense everything around me, the crushing pressure of the space, the overwhelming darkness, and the heat, more than physical, It was spiritual, pressing down on me like a weight I couldn't escape. My body no longer seemed to exist. I couldn't feel my hands or feet. But there was a force, relentless and unyielding, pulling me downward, deeper and deeper. The silence was deafening, almost suffocating. Yet I could hear faint, distant sounds, low, mournful groans echoing from somewhere far off. It was as if the very air itself was heavy with despair. The world around me stretched out endlessly, and I had no idea where I was going or why. Just as I began to wonder if I was lost forever in this eternal abyss, I felt the presence of something, or someone. It wasn't a physical form, but it felt as though a presence were walking beside me, guiding me through the unbearable space. The figures I saw were not like people I knew, they were dark, twisted, distorted. Their shapes shifted with every step, and their voices were low, guttural, almost mocking. But their purpose was clear, they were ushering me deeper into the abyss, pulling me forward. I tried to scream, to ask where I was, but my voice couldn't find its way out. My body, my soul, everything about me felt out of control. I was no longer John Anderson, the man who had watched those sermons, the man who believed in God's grace. I was just a lost soul drifting through a hellish landscape that seemed to stretch on forever. Eventually, we arrived at a place unlike anything I could have imagined. A massive fiery gate loomed ahead of me. The flames burned so fiercely that the heat alone was unbearable, searing my skin even though I didn't have a physical form. The air was thick with sulfur and the stench of decay. It felt as if I had entered some kind of prison, a place that held the souls of the lost, those condemned to suffer for eternity. Then, through the haze of fire and smoke, I could barely comprehend what I was seeing. But as I stared at BENSON IDAHOSA, shackled and suffering in the midst of flames, a wave of disbelief and horror washed over me. The heat of the fire intensified. But it wasn't the flames that burned me, it was the overwhelming realization that the man I had admired, the preacher whose words had once inspired me, was now in torment in this hellish place. How could this be? How could the man who had preached so powerfully about God's love, about faith, about salvation, end up here? My heart shattered with confusion and sorrow as I stared into his eyes, seeing a depth of regret and pain that I had never expected. The shadowy figures surrounding us seemed to mock me, and one of them stepped forward, its voice barely audible above the roar of flames. Yet the words rang clear, "You're here because you were led astray. You followed the wrong path." I wanted to scream, to ask what this meant, to understand why this was happening. But all I could do was stand frozen, watching as Idahosa's eyes met mine with profound sorrow. It became clear in that moment that this wasn't a dream or a vision, it was real. The heat grew more intense, and my mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. How could someone like him, who had preached with such power and faith, end up in such a place? The scene before me was almost too much to bear. I wanted to look away, but something in me refused. I had to understand, had to know why this man, this teacher of faith, was here in hell. Just as I was about to ask the question burning in my chest, I saw Idahosa move. Slowly, he lifted his head, and our eyes locked. The pain in his gaze was almost unbearable. There was no defiance, no anger in his eyes, just deep regret and sorrow. It was as if he had come to understand the full weight of his actions, both in life and now, in eternity. We stood there for what felt like an eternity. amidst the searing heat and the chaotic roars of fire surrounding us. My thoughts were scattered. But then Idahosa spoke. His voice weak yet carrying a power I couldn't quite explain. "You're here because of me," he said softly. And the word struck me like a bolt of lightning. "What do you mean?" I whispered, barely able to comprehend. Idahosa's chains rattled slightly as he shifted, never breaking eye contact. "I led you down the wrong path," he said, his voice full of sorrow. "In life, I taught you things that weren't right. I preached a message that promised prosperity. That said faith was about getting material wealth and that God would bless you with riches. But I was wrong. I led you, and so many others, into a false understanding of what faith truly is." The words felt like a slap to my face. And I was paralyzed. How could this be? I had followed his teachings for so long, trusted in the path he had laid out for me. How could I have been so wrong? I was overwhelmed as I listened to Benson Idahosa's words. He had once been a guiding light for me, showing me a path I believed led to salvation and blessings. But standing in this fiery place, hearing the deep regret in his voice, I couldn't deny the truth of what he was saying. He continued speaking, his voice quieter but more intense with every word. "I promised healing, prosperity, and success," Idahosa said, his tone filled with sorrow. "But I neglected to teach what's truly important. True faith is about surrendering to God's will, not about what we can gain from Him. It's not about riches or power. It's about love, humility, and serving others." As I listened, my heart ached. The weight of his confession pressed down on me like a physical force. Everything I had believed in, everything I had worked for, suddenly seemed empty. I had been chasing the wrong dream, driven by the false belief that God's blessings were tied to material gain. But Idahosa's words shattered that illusion. He spoke with raw honesty, acknowledging the mistakes he had made. And it was clear that this realization had come too late. Many followed me because they wanted something: money, success, the things of this world, he continued, his voice heavy with grief. I didn't show them the true gospel. I didn't teach them what Jesus really came to do. I taught them to trust in prosperity. And in doing so, I led them away from the true heart of the message. A knot tightened in my stomach as the full weight of his words hit me. It wasn't just that Idahosa had failed as a preacher, it was that his teachings had distorted the gospel. People had believed that following God meant gaining wealth and success. But the truth was far deeper than that. It was about loving God for who He is, not for what He could give. For a moment, I stood there, processing what I had just heard. My thoughts were a whirlwind, and I wanted to scream, to demand more answers. But deep down, I knew this moment wasn't about what I wanted. It was about the painful truth that needed to be faced. This was a revelation, a wake-up call not just for Idahosa, but for me too. Idahosa's voice softened again, almost as if he were speaking to himself as much as to me. I preached that faith would lead to wealth. But that wasn't true faith. Faith is trust in God even when we don't understand His plan. It's surrendering to His will, knowing that He knows what's best for us. It's not about gaining things in this life, it's about gaining Him. I could feel my heart breaking as he spoke. I had spent so much of my life focused on the wrong things, thinking that faith was a means to an end, that it was a transaction. But now, standing here in the midst of the flames, with the man who had once guided me, I realized how misplaced my focus had been. True faith wasn't about asking for blessings. It was about being in a relationship with God, about serving Him, loving Him, and trusting Him with everything, even when it didn't make sense. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. I had spent years of my life chasing after the wrong things, putting my faith in materialism and the promises of worldly success. I had been following a false gospel, one that Idahosa himself had inadvertently promoted. And I had allowed myself to be led astray. Idahosa looked at me with a mix of regret and compassion. "I have seen the truth now," he said, his voice full of sorrow. "I can only hope that you will learn from my mistakes. Don't follow the path I took. Don't make the same errors I did." As I stood there, listening to his words, I knew that this encounter was something I would never forget. It was a pivotal moment, a turning point in my life where I was faced with the truth of what faith really meant, and how I had strayed so far from it. The weight of his words pressed down on me, sinking into my soul. It was a harsh truth, but it was undeniable. Faith wasn't about what I could get from God, it was about loving Him and trusting Him no matter where I was or what I had. As I stood there, surrounded by the heat and chaos, everything I had once valued, my dreams, ambitions, and desires, seemed so insignificant. Idahosa's confession burned into my heart like a brand. And for the first time, I understood what true wealth really meant. The flames around us seemed to intensify, suffocating me with their heat. The once clear air now felt thick and oppressive, distorting everything around me. I couldn't look away from Idahosa's chained form, writhing in this hellish place. The man who had once been full of authority and power, preaching faith and healing, was now completely broken. His massive chains contrasted starkly with the confident preacher I had admired so much years ago. The man who had spoken so passionately about faith now bore the painful reality of his own misguided beliefs. Idahosa's eyes, filled with deep regret, met mine. His voice, hoarse but unmistakably clear, broke the silence again. "I made a grave mistake," he said, the weight of his confession evident. "I preached a gospel that wasn't the full truth. I spent too much time focusing on material wealth and prosperity. I led many people, including you, astray with my false teachings." His voice shook with emotion. But there was no anger, only sorrow. It was the sorrow of someone who had finally come face to face with the truth of their actions. "I thought I was serving God," he continued. "But I let my desire for success and recognition cloud my judgment. I told people that God's blessings were about financial gain and that if they had enough faith, they would prosper. But that was a lie." The chains rattled as he shifted. His gaze locked on me. There was a calmness in his eyes now, a strange sense of peace that came from admitting his mistakes. "I preached that faith was about prosperity and success," he said softly. "But faith is not about what we can acquire in this life. It's about our hearts. It's about our relationship with God. About surrendering to His will and trusting Him, no matter what our circumstances look like." Each word he spoke pierced my heart, every sentence a painful reminder of how I had misunderstood the essence of faith. I had spent years believing that faith was about material gain, that if I followed the rules, worked hard, and gave generously, God would reward me with wealth and success. But now, standing here, hearing Idahosa's confession, I realized how wrong I had been. I told people that if they gave money to the ministry, they would be healed, that they would be blessed. I told them their giving would unlock God's blessings, he continued, his voice filled with sorrow. But I didn't teach them that God's love isn't something we can earn. It's a gift. I didn't teach them about the real gospel, about repentance, humility, and loving others the way Jesus did. I made it about money. And that was my mistake. His words hit me like a blow to the chest. The beliefs I had held for so long, the ways I had invested my time, money, and energy, were now revealed as a distortion of the true message. I had bought into the idea that if I gave enough, worked hard enough, and trusted enough, God would give me the life I wanted. But for the first time, I understood that I had misunderstood the true nature of God's love and faith. I used God's name to manipulate people. And that's why I'm here. Idahosa said quietly, his eyes now cast downward. His admission was like a cold wind. But it was the truth. And in that moment, I could no longer deny it. The weight of Idahosa's words pressed deeply into my heart. And with each sentence, I could feel the layers of misunderstanding and false beliefs slowly peeling away. He admitted to the wrong path he had led so many down, including myself, teaching that prosperity and success were the ultimate signs of faith. The realization hit me hard. Faith wasn't about acquiring material wealth or status, it was about surrendering to God, loving Him for who He is, and trusting His plan, even when things didn't make sense. Idahosa's words were filled with deep regret, as he spoke about how his teachings had led others astray, and the way he had manipulated faith for personal gain. He spoke not from the pulpit anymore, but from a place of sorrow, acknowledging his mistakes and the damage they had caused. I thought I was serving God, he said softly. But I allowed my desire for recognition and success to cloud my judgment. I misled people, telling them that if they gave enough, God would bless them with material wealth. That wasn't true faith. Each word seemed to pierce my soul, and I could feel my understanding of faith shifting, unraveling the foundation I had built my beliefs upon. I had followed Idahosa's teachings for so long, thinking that faith was about what I could get from God, success, prosperity, blessings. But now, standing in the midst of this hellish place, I could see how wrong I had been. Faith was not a transaction. It wasn't about earning God's favor through sacrifices or financial offerings. He continued, his voice growing more intense. I told people their struggles were a result of their lack of faith. I blamed them for their hardships, telling them that if they just believed enough or gave enough, they would prosper. But I didn't teach them the truth, that suffering is not always a punishment. I misled them. The weight of his confession was crushing. It wasn't just about him, it was about me too. My whole life had been shaped by these distorted teachings, and I had spent so much time chasing after the wrong things. The idea that faith could be bought or earned had driven my actions. But now, in this place, I was confronted with the painful truth: true faith is about surrendering to God, not trying to earn blessings. I stood there, my heart aching with the depth of his words. They were not just a lesson for him, they were a lesson for me as well. I had spent so many years chasing after material things, believing that faith was the means to attain them. But now, I was beginning to understand that faith was not about gaining material wealth or success. It was about trusting in God's plan, even in the midst of suffering, and surrendering to His will. I had earned, but something freely given. The truth that Idahosa shared with me echoed in my heart. A truth I had long ignored: faith isn't about what we can gain, but about what we can offer. It's not about accumulating wealth, health, or success, but about surrendering our will to God's. True faith means trusting God, not seeking personal gain, but living a life of love, humility, And grace. Idahosa's voice softened even more as he continued. I preached prosperity, John. But I failed to teach the heart of the gospel. The true blessing is not in wealth or success, but in surrendering your life to God, following Him with a pure heart, and loving others the way He loves us. The real power of faith lies in trusting God through all circumstances, not seeking personal gain. His words were a deep, sobering revelation. All those years of believing that faith was about gaining material blessings now felt hollow. I had spent my life chasing the wrong goals, putting my trust in a false system that measured success by what could be accumulated. But now, listening to Idahosa's confession, I understood that faith was much deeper than I had ever imagined. I'm sorry, John, he whispered. I led people to believe that sacrifices could buy them blessings, that their giving could unlock God's favor. But that's not the gospel. The gospel is about grace, about love, about humility. It's about surrendering everything to God, not expecting anything in return. That's what I should have preached. As the flames around us seemed to flicker and wane, I could feel the air growing still, and the heat around us lessening. Every word that Idahosa spoke was like a weight lifting from my heart, revealing the truth I had been blind to for so long. The man who had once been my inspiration, my guide, was now showing me the most profound truth of all. True faith is not about what we can gain but about what we can give. The life I had been living, chasing after wealth and success, was a path leading nowhere. It wasn't about what I could get from God, but what I could offer Him. It was about living humbly, loving others as He loves us, and trusting His plan, even when it didn't make sense. This encounter, this moment of reckoning, had opened my eyes to the real essence of faith, and I knew I would never be the same again. I realized that true wealth wasn't something I could earn but was something I could only receive by surrendering my heart to God. Idahosa's painful confession turned out to be the greatest gift he could have given me. And as I stood there in the flames, listening to his final lessons, I knew my life would never be the same again. As his words lingered in the air, the oppressive heat and suffocating darkness began to fade. I felt an overwhelming sense of peace, a strange stillness in the midst of all that fire and suffering. It was as if the very flames were retreating, their power diminishing with each word spoken. The weight on my heart seemed to lift, and I felt myself being pulled away from the fiery pit and back toward the light. John, Idahosa's voice called out. Softer now, more distant. It's not too late. You can still change your path. I didn't know if it was the force of his words or something beyond comprehension, but I felt myself rising, floating upwards, away from the heat and torment. The scene around me grew hazy, and the world of darkness seemed to slip away. My heart, once so heavy with confusion and regret, was now filled with something new, something I couldn't name but knew was good. As I ascended, the final images of Idahosa and the flames faded into the distance. Then, I woke up. I was lying in a hospital bed, the sterile smell of antiseptic filling my nostrils. My chest ached from the heart attack I had suffered, but it was nothing compared to the deep spiritual ache I had felt just moments before. The reality of what I had experienced hit me hard. My near-death experience, the vivid encounter with BENSON Idahosa, his confession, and the lessons he had imparted, it felt too real to dismiss as a dream. The weight of everything Idahosa had shared with me was still fresh in my mind. It wasn't just a vision or a hallucination. It was a wake-up call. As I lay there, I realized that I had been given a second chance, not just at life, but at faith. The man I had once idolized, whose teachings had shaped so much of my spiritual journey, had opened my eyes to the truth. Real faith wasn't about what I could acquire from God, but about humbly submitting my life to Him. True wealth wasn't in material success, but in spiritual richness, trusting in God's love and grace, not my ability to manipulate my circumstances. I felt a profound shift within me. I was no longer angry or bitter about the struggles I had endured, the financial troubles, the years of striving for success. None of it seemed as important anymore. What mattered now was my relationship with God, living a life of humility and surrendering to His will, not for what I could get, but for what I could give. When I left the hospital, I walked out with a renewed sense of purpose. I knew my life would never be the same again. I wasn't just going to chase after wealth or success anymore. I was going to pursue a deeper relationship with God, one grounded in love and trust. And though my circumstances might still be challenging, I now knew that I had found the true blessing in life: spiritual peace, humility, and faith. The lessons from Idahosa had changed me forever. I had been lost in the pursuit of the wrong things, but now I understood that true fulfillment came from a heart that was fully surrendered to God, trusting in His plan, and living out His love in every aspect of life. My life had just begun anew. If you believe in God and near-death experiences, subscribe to Life at NDE today. Discover inspiring messages from God through powerful near-death stories that bring hope and understanding. Hit subscribe now and join us in spreading the light of faith.